My stepson Marcus thought my balcony accident was the funniest thing in the world, cracking jokes about how I took a tumble like a broken marionette right in front of the entire family. What he didn't know was that this frail old woman he was mocking owned half the real estate in Millbrook Heights, including the very apartment building where he lived rent-free. Oh, the irony, because when I finally decided I'd had enough of his cruelty, Marcus discovered that some accidents aren't really accidents at all. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. It started 3 months ago on a rainy Tuesday evening in October. I was Evelyn Hartwell, 74 years old, living quietly in my modest garden apartment on Elm Street in the small town of Millbrook Heights. To everyone around me, I was just another elderly widow getting by on a pension, shuffling to the grocery store with my cane, tending to my small herb garden, and keeping to myself. Marcus Blackwood was my late husband, Theodore's son from his first marriage. Theodore had passed away 2 years prior, leaving behind a complicated family dynamic that I'd been navigating ever since. Marcus was 32, unemployed more often than not, and had been living in the luxury penthouse apartment across town that Theodore had purchased for him years earlier. To Marcus, I was nothing more than an inconvenient reminder of his father's second life, a burden he tolerated because it was expected. The accident happened during what was supposed to be a family dinner at my place. I'd invited Marcus, his wife Stephanie, and their 8-year-old daughter Lily over for Sunday roast, hoping to maintain some connection to Theodore's memory. It was a tradition I'd started after the funeral, trying to keep the family together despite the obvious tension. The evening had been going reasonably well until I excused myself to water the plants on my small balcony. It was something I did every evening at sunset. Theodore used to call it my meditation time. The balcony was only on the 2nd floor, overlooking the building's courtyard, but it had always been my peaceful retreat. I was reaching for the watering can when my foot caught on the loose floorboard that had been wobbling for weeks. In an instant, I lost my balance and tumbled over the low railing, landing hard on the concrete below. The pain was immediate and excruciating, a sharp crack in my left hip and a burning sensation shooting through my entire left side. Lily screamed. Stephanie gasped and rushed to call an ambulance. But Marcus started laughing. Not a nervous laugh or a shocked reaction. A genuine belly-deep laugh that echoed through the courtyard. As I lay there writhing in pain, unable to move, he stood on the balcony above me and called down, "Well, that's one way to make an exit, Evelyn. Maybe next time check your footing before you go dancing with gravity." The ambulance arrived 20 minutes later. As the paramedics carefully loaded me onto a stretcher, Marcus was still chuckling and making comments to Stephanie about how I'd performed quite the acrobatic routine, and how it was typical that I'd find a way to make everything about myself, even during a family dinner. The hospital stay was brutal. Fractured hip, 2 broken ribs, severe bruising along my left side, and a mild concussion. The doctors said I was lucky. At my age, a fall like that could have been fatal. I spent 6 days in the hospital and then another 3 weeks barely, able to walk, relying on a walker and home care assistance. During my recovery, Marcus visited exactly once. He showed up on a Thursday afternoon, clearly having been pressured by Stephanie, and spent the entire 15-minute visit making jokes about my flying lesson and suggesting I stick to ground-level activities from now on. When I winced in pain trying to adjust my position in bed, he laughed again and said, "Come on, Evelyn, you're being dramatic. It was just a little tumble. You're acting like you fell off Mount Everest." That was the moment something inside me shifted. Not just anger. I'd been angry before. This was something colder, more calculated. As I watched this man, this person who shared a name with my beloved Theodore, mock my pain and vulnerability, I realized that Marcus had fundamentally misunderstood who he was dealing with. Because while Marcus saw a helpless old woman who'd taken a clumsy fall, the truth was far more complex. The modest apartment where I lived? It was just one of 47 properties I owned throughout Millbrook Heights and the surrounding counties. The simple pension he assumed I lived on? That was just walking around money compared to the investment, portfolio and business holdings I'd spent 50 years building alongside Theodore. My late husband had been a successful contractor, but what most people didn't know was that I'd been the brains behind the operation from day one. Every property acquisition, every development deal, every strategic business decision, that had been my work. Theodore handled the public face and the construction crews, but I handled the money, the negotiations, and the long-term planning. When Theodore passed, I'd made a deliberate choice to maintain a low profile. I was grieving, tired of the spotlight, and wanted to live simply. I kept the modest apartment as my primary residence, drove my old Honda Civic, and let people assume whatever they wanted about my circumstances. It was peaceful. It was private. And it allowed me to observe people's true character when they thought I had nothing to offer them. Marcus had failed that test spectacularly. As I lay in that hospital bed, listening to him joke about my balcony diving career, I made a decision. Marcus wanted to treat me like a powerless old woman? Fine. Let him think that. Let him keep laughing and making his cruel jokes. Because when the time came for the truth to surface, when Marcus finally understood exactly who he'd been mocking and what kind of power I actually wielded, I wanted to make sure he wasn't laughing anymore. The wheels were already turning in my mind. It was time for Marcus to learn that some falls are accidental, and others are carefully orchestrated. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. What Marcus didn't know, what nobody in Millbrook Heights knew, was that the frail old woman he'd been mocking owned more property in this town than the mayor himself. My secret wasn't just money. It was an empire built in shadows, and I'd spent decades perfecting the art of invisible power. The story of my hidden wealth began 48 years ago when Theodore and I were just starting out. He was a small-town contractor with big dreams and calloused hands. I was a 26-year-old bookkeeper with a mind for numbers and an eye for opportunity that most people overlooked. While Theodore focused on building houses, I focused on buying the land they'd eventually sit on. It started small. I'd study city planning documents, attend boring zoning meetings, and listen to local gossip about which areas were slated for development. When farmers were struggling or elderly landowners needed quick cash, I'd quietly make offers through shell companies and law firms. Never in my own name. Never with any fanfare. Just methodical, strategic acquisitions that seemed insignificant at the time. By the time Theodore's construction business took off in the 1980s, I owned parcels scattered throughout 3 counties. When the town expanded eastward, I owned the land. When they built the new shopping complex on Miller Road, I owned the ground it sat on. When young families started moving to Millbrook Heights for the good schools and small-town charm, they rented apartments in buildings I owned. The beauty of it was the invisibility. All my properties were held through a web of LLCs and trust, funds with names like Millbrook Development Associates and Heartland Property Management. To anyone looking at public records, these were just faceless corporate entities. The little old lady living in apartment 2B on Elm Street? She couldn't possibly be connected to the largest private landowner in the region. Theodore knew, of course, but he understood my preference for privacy. After his first wife left him in a messy public divorce that cost him half his business, he appreciated having a partner who operated in the shadows. We made a good team. He built the reputation. I built the portfolio. When people praised Theodore for his success, he'd smile and give me a subtle wink across the room. Even after Theodore's business grew into Blackwood construction, even after we moved into the big house on Maple Avenue for a few years to keep up appearances, I maintained my simple lifestyle. The modest apartment on Elm Street became my retreat, my thinking space. That's where I'd sit with my ledgers and legal documents, planning the next acquisition, while neighbors assumed I was just another retiree clipping coupons. The penthouse apartment where Marcus lived? I'd purchased that building in 1995 when the previous owner defaulted on his mortgage. The luxury cars Marcus drove? Leased through one of my companies. The country club membership that let him network with Millbrook Heights elite. The club. Sat on land I'd owned since 1987. Marcus had been living in my world his entire adult life, benefiting from my investments, and he didn't have a clue. When Theodore introduced me to Marcus 20 years ago, I'd hoped we could build a real family relationship. Marcus was 12 then, angry about his parents' divorce and suspicious of his father's new wife. I understood his resentment and tried to be patient. I never pushed for the stepmother role, never tried to replace his biological mother. I just tried to be present, supportive, and kind. But as Marcus grew older, his attitude toward me hardened rather than softened. He saw me as an outsider who'd stolen his father's attention, and worse, as a gold digger who'd somehow tricked Theodore into marriage. The irony was devastating. If anything, Theodore had married up financially, though he was the only one. Who knew it? Marcus's contempt became more obvious after Theodore and I moved back to the simple apartment following Theodore's heart attack in 2018. The doctors had recommended a quieter lifestyle, less stress, and I'd been happy to step away from the big house and social obligations. But to Marcus, this looked like his father downgrading because of me. Further proof that I was some kind of burden or bad influence. After Theodore's funeral, Marcus made his feelings crystal clear. During the reading of the will, when he learned that Theodore had left him the penthouse apartment and a substantial trust fund, he'd looked at me with barely concealed pity and said, "Don't worry, Evelyn. I know Dad probably didn't leave you much, but I'll make sure you're taken care of. Family takes care of family, even if it's complicated family." I'd smiled and thanked him, playing the grateful widow while internally calculating that the trust fund he'd just inherited was less than what I earned in quarterly dividends from a single commercial property. The decision to maintain my anonymity after Theodore's death had been deliberate. I was 72, tired of the business world's demands and genuinely grieving. I wanted to live quietly, to tend my garden, to read my books, and to see if any of Theodore's family would value me for who I was rather than what I could provide. Marcus had failed that test from day one, but I'd given him the benefit of the doubt. Grief affects people differently. Maybe he needed time to adjust. Maybe he'd eventually see past his preconceptions. But the balcony incident had been the final straw. As I lay in that hospital bed, listening to him mock my pain, watching him treat my genuine injury as entertainment, I realized that Marcus would never see me as anything more than a convenient target for his cruelty. That's when I decided it was time for him to learn the truth about exactly who he'd been laughing at. The phone calls started the day I got home from the hospital. My lawyer, Patricia Summers from the firm of Summers, Mackenzie & Associates, had been handling my business affairs for 30 years. She was one of the few people who knew the full scope of my holdings. "Patricia," I said when she answered, my voice still shaky from the pain medication, "I need you to pull together a complete portfolio overview. Every property, every investment, every business holding. I want it all documented and ready for presentation." "Of course, Mrs. Hartwell. May I ask what's prompting this review?" I looked out my window toward the luxury building where Marcus lived, where he was probably right now laughing about his stepmother's acrobatic performance to anyone who'd listen. "Let's just say it's time for some family education," I told her. "And Patricia, I want you to start with the Grandview Towers property. I think it's time I took a more hands-on approach to that particular investment. Grandview Towers, the luxury apartment building where Marcus lived rent-free in the penthouse, courtesy of what he believed was his father's generosity. What he didn't know was that his father had never owned that building at all. I had, for 28 years. And now it was time for Marcus to get his first lesson in exactly who held the power in this family. Marcus wasn't content with just making jokes about my accident. Over the following weeks, as I struggled through physical therapy and fought to regain my mobility, his cruelty evolved into something far more calculated and vicious. What started as tasteless humor transformed into systematic humiliation, and I began to understand that my stepson wasn't just insensitive, he was genuinely malicious. The first escalation came during my second week of recovery. I was using a walker to get around, moving slowly and carefully as the doctors had instructed. Marcus showed up unannounced on a Thursday afternoon, claiming he wanted to check on me. But I could see the smirk playing at the corners of his mouth before he even spoke. "Still doing the robot walk, I see," he said, watching me shuffle from the kitchen to the living room. "You know, Evelyn, they make these things called nursing homes for people who can't take care of themselves anymore. Might be time to start thinking about your options." When I didn't respond, he continued. "I mean, look at this place. It's not exactly suitable for someone with mobility challenges. That balcony is obviously a death trap. What if you fall? Again? What if next time you're not so lucky?" The way he said lucky made my skin crawl. There was something in his tone, a hint of disappointment, as if he thought my survival had been an inconvenience rather than a relief. 2 days later, he brought Stephanie and Lily for another family visit. This time, he'd prepared what he called a safety demonstration for his daughter. While I sat in my recliner, still too sore to move quickly, Marcus walked out onto my balcony and began dramatically reenacting my fall. "So, Grandma Evelyn was out here watering her plants," he announced loudly enough for the neighbors to hear, "and she was reaching like this." He exaggerated a wobbling motion, arms flailing comically. And then whoop! He pretended to lose, his balance grabbing the railing theatrically. Down she goes, like a sack of potatoes. 8-year-old Lily giggled uncertainly, not understanding the cruelty of what she was witnessing. Stephanie looked uncomfortable but said nothing. And I sat there, trapped in my chair by pain and mobility limitations, forced to watch my stepson turn my trauma into a performance for his own entertainment. "Maybe we should install some padding down there," Marcus continued, pointing to the courtyard below. "You know, like those bouncy castles at kids' parties. Then if Evelyn decides to go flying again, she'll just bounce right back up." The physical therapy sessions became another source of his amusement. Every Tuesday and Thursday, a van would pick me up and take me to Millbrook Rehabilitation Center for my appointments. The process was exhausting and often painful. Learning to walk without the walker, rebuilding strength in my damaged hip, working through the stiffness that had settled into my entire left side. Marcus made it his business to be around during pickup times. He'd stand in the courtyard or sit on the front steps of the building, making commentary as I slowly made my way to the van with my physical therapist's assistance. "There she goes again," he'd call out to anyone within earshot. "Off to learn how to walk like a normal person. Think they have a remedial program for people who forget how gravity works?" He started referring to me as Crash Test Evelyn and the human bowling ball. When neighbors asked about my recovery, he'd shake his head sadly and say things like, "We're hoping she'll eventually graduate from the walker to maybe a cane, but honestly, at her age, once you start falling apart, it's all downhill from there." The worst part was how he involved Lily in his mockery. During family dinners at his penthouse apartment, dinners I was now expected to attend despite my limited mobility, he'd encourage his daughter to ask me questions about my flying adventure. "Lily wants to know if you saw any birds while you were up in the air," he'd say with a straight face. "She's curious about what it feels like to fly without wings." When I tried to explain to Lily that falling wasn't flying and that it had been scary and painful, Marcus would interrupt. "Oh, come on, Evelyn. Don't be so dramatic. You make it sound like some terrible ordeal. It was just a little tumble. Kids, fall off their bikes all the time, and don't make such a big deal about it. The financial harassment started in my 4th week of recovery. Marcus began making pointed comments about my medical expenses and the cost of my physical therapy. Despite the fact that I had excellent insurance and was more than capable of paying my own bills, he started presenting himself to neighbors and family friends as my reluctant financial caretaker. "It's been tough," he'd tell Mrs. Henderson from apartment 1A, making sure I could hear from my open window. "These medical bills just keep piling up, and you know how it is with elderly people on fixed incomes. Stephanie and I are doing our best to help out, but it's putting a real strain on our family budget." He started bringing me groceries, cheap, generic brands that he'd make a show of carrying up to my apartment while complaining loudly about the expense. "I know you're used to name brands, Evelyn, but we all have to make sacrifices. These store brands are just as good, and frankly, at your age, I don't think your taste buds are working well enough to tell the difference anyway." The groceries came with lectures about realistic expectations and living within your means. He'd go through my kitchen cabinets, tossing out items he deemed unnecessary luxuries. My good olive oil, the imported tea I enjoyed, the organic vegetables I'd been buying for years. "This stuff is ridiculous," he'd say, holding up a jar of local honey I'd purchased from the farmer's market. "You're paying premium prices for sugar with a fancy label. I'm going to start doing your shopping for you. Clearly, you need someone with better judgment making these decisions." When I protested that I could handle my own shopping and that I preferred certain brands, he'd shake his head patronizingly. "Evelyn, you just took a header off a balcony because you couldn't handle the simple task of watering plants. Maybe it's time to admit that your decision-making abilities aren't what they used to be." The social isolation was perhaps the cruelest aspect of his campaign. Marcus began intercepting my mail, claiming he was helping by screening my correspondence for important matters I might miss. He'd answer my phone when friends called, telling them I was having a bad day or not really up for company, without consulting me. When my friend Margaret from the church called to check on me, Marcus told her I was struggling with some cognitive issues related to my head injury and that visitors tended to confuse and agitate me. When my book club tried to arrange a visit, he explained that I was embarrassed about my condition and preferred to rest in privacy. Slowly but systematically, he was cutting me off from my support network, making me appear incapable and fragile, while positioning himself as the long-suffering family member bearing the burden of my care. The breaking point came during week 6 of my recovery. I was finally strong enough to walk without the walker, using just a cane for stability. Marcus had called ahead to say he was bringing dinner, another of his charitable gestures that came with side helpings of humiliation. When he arrived, he was carrying a bag from Burger Palace, the cheap fast food place near the highway. "I thought we'd have a picnic," he announced cheerfully. "Out on your famous balcony. You know, help you get back on that horse that threw you." The suggestion was clearly intended to terrorize me. I hadn't been back on the balcony since my accident, and the thought of eating out there, especially with Marcus watching for any sign of fear or weakness, made my stomach clench with anxiety. "I'd prefer to eat inside," I said quietly. "Oh, come on," Marcus pressed. "You can't be afraid of your own balcony forever. What's the worst that could happen? Lightning doesn't strike twice in the same place, right?" He was already heading toward the balcony door, setting up a small folding table he'd brought with him. "Besides, I brought burgers instead of your usual fancy food. Much more appropriate for outdoor dining. Less chance of attracting those pesky gravity waves that seem to follow you around." As I sat there, forced to eat greasy fast food on the very spot where I'd nearly died, listening to Marcus make jokes about testing my balance and keeping a safe distance from the railing, I realized that his cruelty wasn't random or thoughtless. It was deliberate, calculated, and escalating. Marcus wasn't just mocking my accident. He was systematically dismantling my independence, my dignity, and my connections to the world around me. He was treating me like a broken thing that existed, solely for his entertainment and convenience. That night, as I sat in my apartment nursing my bruised pride and my still aching body, I made a decision. Marcus wanted to play games with a helpless old woman? Fine. But he was about to discover that this particular old woman had been playing games at a much higher level for much longer than he could imagine. It was time to remind Marcus that the most dangerous opponents are the ones who let you think you're winning. The turning point came on a crisp November morning when I finally decided to stop being a victim and start being a strategist. Marcus had pushed too far, isolated me too completely, and underestimated me too thoroughly. It was time for this supposedly helpless old woman to remind him that wisdom, patience, and carefully accumulated power could be far more dangerous than youth and cruelty. My first call was to Patricia Summers, but this time I had a very specific agenda. Patricia, I need you to compile a complete dossier on Marcus Blackwood. Employment history, credit report, legal issues, everything. I also want a detailed analysis of his current living situation, including all the arrangements Theodore made for him. Mrs. Hartwell, Patricia said carefully, may I ask what you're planning? Justice, I replied simply, and education. Marcus has been operating under some very dangerous misconceptions about his position in this family. It's time to correct those errors. While Patricia worked on gathering intelligence, I began my own investigation. Despite my physical limitations, I was far from helpless when it came to observation and analysis. I started timing Marcus's routines, noting his habits, and most importantly, listening to what he said when he thought I wasn't paying attention. The first revelation came during one of his charity visits, when he took a phone call in my kitchen, assuming I couldn't hear from the living room. His voice carried clearly through my small apartment as he talked to someone about money troubles. Look, I know I'm behind on the payments, but you've got to give me more time, he was saying, his confident demeanor completely absent. My dad's widow is basically my responsibility now, and her medical bills are eating me alive. I'm doing everything I can, but she's like a money pit. I listened with growing interest as he continued to spin his fiction. According to Marcus's version of events, he was the noble stepson sacrificing his own financial security to care for his father's helpless widow. He painted himself as overwhelmed by medical expenses, grocery bills, and the general cost of maintaining an elderly dependent. What made this performance particularly fascinating was that Marcus had never paid a single cent toward any of my expenses. My insurance covered my medical costs, I bought my own groceries, and I managed all my own bills. His sacrifices existed entirely in his imagination. But apparently, he'd been using this sob story to negotiate delays on his own debts. The second piece of intelligence came from Mrs. Henderson, my downstairs neighbor, who seemed eager to share gossip during one of her courtesy check-ins. That stepson of yours seems like such a devoted young man, she said, settling into my kitchen chair with obvious relish. Always here helping out, bringing groceries, though I have to say, some of the stories he tells— What kind of stories? I asked, keeping my voice carefully neutral. Well, he mentioned you've been having some memory issues since your fall, and he seemed quite worried about your ability to handle your finances independently. He was asking if I'd noticed any concerning behavior, any signs that you might be, slipping mentally. The audacity took my breath away. Marcus wasn't just isolating me socially and humiliating me publicly. He was laying the groundwork to have me declared mentally incompetent. In his mind, I was probably just one doctor's evaluation away from being placed under his guardianship, giving him legal control over whatever modest assets he imagined I possessed. Has he asked you about anything specific? I pressed gently. Mrs. Henderson leaned forward conspiratorially. He wanted to know if I'd seen you talking to yourself, or leaving appliances on, or forgetting to lock your door. He said the family was concerned about your safety, especially after the balcony incident. He made it sound like you might be becoming a danger to yourself. That evening, I called Patricia with an urgent request. I need you to arrange for a comprehensive medical evaluation from Dr. Rebecca Chen at Millbrook Medical. Full cognitive, assessment, physical evaluation, everything. I want documented proof of my mental competency, and I want it done immediately. Of course, but may I ask what's prompted this urgency? My stepson is apparently building a case to have me declared incompetent. I want to make sure we have overwhelming evidence to the contrary before he makes his move. Dr. Chen's evaluation took place 3 days later. The results were exactly what I'd expected. Excellent cognitive function for someone my age, with no signs of dementia, confusion, or impaired decision-making capacity. My physical recovery was progressing well, and while I still had some mobility limitations, there was no medical basis for questioning my independence. Armed with this documentation, I began phase 2 of my investigation: financial surveillance. I had Patricia discreetly look into Marcus's actual financial situation, and what we discovered was both illuminating and pathetic. Marcus was drowning in debt, credit cards maxed out, car loans in default, and most significantly, he owed 3 months of association fees on his penthouse apartment. The building management company, which was actually one of my subsidiary companies, though Marcus didn't know that, had been sending increasingly stern notices about his delinquent payments. Even more interesting was the discovery that Marcus had been applying for loans using my name as a reference, claiming I was his dependent and that he was responsible for my care. He'd told potential lenders that he expected to inherit my assets and could use that inheritance as collateral for immediate credit. The picture that emerged was of a man living far beyond his means, desperately trying to maintain an image of success while secretly borrowing against an inheritance he would never receive from a woman whose actual worth he couldn't even imagine. But the most revealing discovery came when I started following up on his employment claims. Marcus had been telling people he was a property development consultant, which sounded impressive but meant absolutely nothing. When Patricia dug deeper, we found that he'd been unemployed for over 8 months, surviving on credit, and the increasingly rare odd jobs he could pick up through his father's old business contacts. The consulting work he claimed to be doing? It consisted of him showing potential buyers around luxury properties during open houses, pretending to be their representative while hoping to pick up small commissions from desperate real estate agents. He wasn't licensed, wasn't qualified, and wasn't actually employed by anyone. Meanwhile, I began my own subtle campaign of observation and documentation. Every time Marcus visited, I started recording our conversations on my phone, capturing his cruel jokes, his lies about my condition, and his increasingly bold suggestions that I should consider my options regarding nursing home placement. Also started reaching out to my old network, the one Marcus had tried so hard to isolate me from. When Margaret called and Marcus tried to intercept, I made sure to be near the phone. When my book club friends expressed concern about my absence, I invited them over for tea, timing their visit for when Marcus was least likely to interfere. The reactions were swift and telling. My friends were shocked by Marcus's behavior during his brief appearances, confused by his proprietary attitude toward my affairs, and increasingly suspicious of his claims about my supposed cognitive decline. "Evelyn," Margaret said after one particularly uncomfortable encounter where Marcus had tried to explain my limitations to my own friends, "that young man seems to have some very strange ideas about your capabilities. You seem perfectly fine to me, but he's talking about you like like you're not even here." The final piece of my intelligence gathering came from an unexpected source: Lily. During one of the forced family dinners, Marcus's 8-year-old daughter quietly asked me a question that revealed more than she realized. "Grandma Evelyn," she whispered when her father was in the kitchen, "why does Daddy say you're poor now? He told Mommy that Grandpa Theodore left you without enough money. But you seem to have nice things in your apartment." Out of the mouths of babes, Even a child could see through Marcus's fiction, recognizing that my lifestyle didn't match his claims about my supposed poverty and dependence. That night, I sat in my apartment with all the evidence spread before me. Medical documentation proving my competency, financial records revealing Marcus's deception, recorded conversations capturing his cruelty, and witness accounts of his behavior. The picture was clear. Marcus wasn't just a cruel stepson, making tasteless jokes. He was a predator, systematically working to isolate and control me while positioning himself to take whatever he thought I had. But Marcus had made one crucial error in his calculations. He'd assumed I was exactly what I appeared to be, a vulnerable, elderly woman with limited resources and no real power. It was time to show him just how wrong he was. And I was going to start with the one thing he valued most, his precious penthouse apartment and the lifestyle he thought made him superior to his poor, helpless stepmother. Tomorrow, I would make my first move. Marcus wanted to play games. With an old woman's life? Fine. But he was about to discover that this particular old woman had been playing games at a level he couldn't even comprehend, and she was tired of letting him think he was winning. The betrayal I discovered next cut deeper than Marcus's cruelty ever could. While I'd been focused on documenting his financial lies and social manipulation, I hadn't been paying attention to what was happening right under my nose. The revelation came through the most innocent source imaginable, my 8-year-old, step-granddaughter Lily. It was during one of those awkward family dinners at Marcus's penthouse, the ones where I was expected to play the grateful dependent while Marcus performed his role as the magnanimous caregiver. Stephanie had stepped out to take a phone call, and Marcus was in the kitchen opening wine, leaving Lily and me alone in the living room. "Grandma Evelyn," Lily said quietly, glancing toward the kitchen to make sure her father couldn't hear. "I'm sorry Daddy laughs about your accident. Mommy says it's not nice, but Daddy says grown-ups have different kinds of jokes." I was about to reassure her when she continued, her voice dropping to an even quieter whisper. "But I don't understand why Daddy tells people you're his real mommy sometimes. At school, when parents ask about our family, he says you're his mother, and that his real mother lives far away. Is that another grown-up joke?" The words hit me like a physical blow. I managed to keep my expression neutral, but inside, my mind was racing. "What exactly does Daddy say about our family, sweetheart?" Lily looked uncomfortable, clearly sensing she might be revealing something she shouldn't. "Well, at the parent-teacher conference last month, Mrs. Rodriguez asked about grandparents for the family tree project. Daddy told her that you were his mother and that you'd been sick, which is why you couldn't come to school events. He said you had, what's that word, dementia?" "Dementia?" I asked, my voice barely steady. "Yes, that's it. He said you had dementia and couldn't remember things properly, so he had to take care of you. Mrs. Rodriguez said it was very nice that he was such a good son." The room seemed to tilt around me. Marcus wasn't just spreading lies about my mental state to neighbors and creditors. He was creating an entirely fictional family narrative, positioning himself as my devoted son rather than my stepson, and using my supposed dementia as a way to explain away any inconsistencies in his story. "Has Daddy said anything else about our family?" I asked gently. Lily nodded, warming to the topic now that she saw I wasn't upset with her. "He told the man who came to our door last week, the one with the papers, that you were his dependent and that he was your legal guardian. The man asked if you lived with us, and Daddy said you were too sick to live alone but too proud to move in, so he had to take care of you from far away." Legal guardian. The words echoed in my head as the full scope of Marcus's deception became clear. He wasn't just planning to have me declared incompetent. He was already claiming to be my guardian, using that false authority to negotiate with creditors, handle legal matters, and present himself as my official representative. When Stephanie returned from her phone call, I excused myself to use the bathroom, but instead, I quietly made my way to Marcus's home office. The door was slightly ajar, and I could see papers scattered across his desk. Moving as quietly as possible, I positioned myself where I could see the documents without entering the room. What I saw made my blood run cold. There were legal forms partially filled out, guardianship applications, power of attorney documents, and something that looked suspiciously like a preliminary will. Marcus had been forging my signature, practicing it on scratch paper until he could replicate it convincingly. But the most damning evidence was a handwritten notebook lying open on his desk. It appeared to be a journal of sorts, documenting what he called evidence of mental decline. The entries were fabricated incidents designed to support a case for incompetency. November 3rd, found E in hallway at 2 a.m., confused about where she was. Had to guide her back to apartment. November 8th, E. Forgot to turn off stove, apartment filled with smoke. Neighbors complained. November 12th. E accused me of stealing her jewelry. Became agitated when I reminded her she'd already looked through jewelry box together. None of these incidents had ever happened. Marcus was creating a fictional medical history, building a paper trail of cognitive decline that existed only in his imagination, but would look compelling to a court. That didn't know better. I took photos of everything with my phone, my hands shaking with rage and adrenaline. This wasn't just cruelty anymore. This was fraud, forgery, and attempted theft on a massive scale. Marcus was systematically working to steal my identity, my autonomy, and whatever assets he thought I possessed. When I returned to the dining room, Marcus was telling Stephanie about his latest sacrifice for my care. The physical therapy bills are just getting ridiculous, he was saying. And now she wants to go back to that expensive grocery store instead of the budget place I found. I keep trying to explain that we have to be realistic about expenses, but you know how elderly people get about change. I sat through the rest of the dinner in silence, watching Marcus perform his concerned stepson routine, while knowing that he was simultaneously forging legal documents in the next room. Every sympathetic nod from Stephanie, every worried comment about my condition felt like another layer of betrayal. The drive home was a blur of anger and calculation. I called Patricia from my apartment, not caring that it was nearly 10 p.m. Patricia, I need an emergency meeting tomorrow morning. Marcus isn't just spreading rumors about my mental state, he's actively committing fraud. I have evidence that he's forging legal documents and claiming to be my guardian. Good God, Evelyn, are you certain? I have photos, and I need you to contact Detective Sarah Walsh at the Millbrook Heights Police Department immediately. We need to document this before he can destroy the evidence. But even as I planned my legal response, a darker realization was settling over me. Marcus's fraud was more than just financial opportunism. It was a complete betrayal of everything his father had valued. Theodore had loved Marcus despite his flaws, had provided for him generously, and had trusted that his son would at least show basic decency toward his widow. Instead, Marcus had taken that trust and twisted it into a weapon, using his position as Theodore's son to legitimize his lies and manipulations. He was trading on his father's reputation, exploiting the community's sympathy, and destroying the family legacy that Theodore had worked so hard to build. The next morning brought another shock. When I checked my mail, I found a letter from Millbrook, community bank addressed to the legal guardian of Evelyn Hartwell. Inside was a notice about concerns regarding unusual account activity and a request for the guardian to contact the bank immediately to discuss protective measures for the client's financial security. Marcus had contacted my bank. Using his false guardian status, he'd apparently raised concerns about my ability to manage my own finances, triggering the bank's elder protection protocols. They were now treating my accounts as potentially compromised, requiring guardian approval for any significant transactions. I called the bank immediately, demanding to speak with the manager. "This is Evelyn Hartwell," I told her. "I understand. Someone claiming to be my guardian has contacted you about my accounts." Yes, Mrs. Hartwell. Your son Marcus expressed some concerns about recent spending patterns and suggested we implement some additional security measures to protect you from potential financial exploitation. My son? I repeated, my voice dangerously calm. Marcus Blackwood is my stepson, not my son. And he has absolutely no legal authority over my finances or any other aspect of my life. There was a long pause. I see. Well, that's quite different from what we were told. Mr. Blackwood presented himself as your primary caregiver and said he had concerns about your cognitive state following a recent accident. I want every restriction on my accounts removed immediately, I said. And I want a full record of every conversation Mr. Blackwood has had with your staff. What he's done constitutes fraud, and I'll be involving law enforcement. By the time I hung up, my hands were shaking with fury. Marcus hadn't just been planning to steal my independence. He'd already started. Bank by bank, institution by institution, he was systematically working to isolate me from my own resources, using forged authority and fabricated medical concerns to convince people that he was protecting me when he was actually victimizing me. But Marcus had made one crucial miscalculation. He'd assumed that a little old lady with a modest apartment and simple lifestyle wouldn't have the resources or the sophistication to fight back against his elaborate fraud. He was about to discover just how wrong he was. And when I was finished with him, Marcus would understand exactly what kind of power he'd been trying to steal, and exactly what kind of woman he'd chosen to victimize. The war had begun, and Marcus didn't even know he'd already lost. The trap I set for Marcus was elegant in its simplicity, and it began with a phone call I made to someone he'd never suspect, his own wife. Stephanie had always struck me as fundamentally decent, just caught in the crossfire of Marcus's manipulation. It was time to test that theory, and, more importantly, to give her a chance to save herself before everything came crashing down. Invited Stephanie for coffee at my apartment, just the two of us, under the pretense of wanting to discuss Lily's upcoming birthday. When she arrived that Tuesday afternoon, she seemed nervous, fidgeting with her purse and avoiding direct eye contact. "Stephanie," I said gently, once we'd settled with our coffee, "I need to ask you something, and I want you to know that whatever you tell me, there won't be any consequences for you or Lily, but I need the truth." She looked up, startled. "About what?" "About Marcus's financial situation, about the stories he's been telling people, about what's really going on in your family." For a moment, I thought she might deny everything, maintain the facade that Marcus had worked so hard to construct. But then her shoulders sagged, and the mask slipped completely. "Oh God, Evelyn," she whispered, tears starting to flow. "I didn't know how far it had gone. I mean, I knew he was exaggerating about taking care of you, but I didn't realize he was actually lying to banks and creditors." "What did you think was happening?" I asked, keeping my voice neutral and supportive. "Marcus told me your medical bills were enormous and that Theodore hadn't left you much money. He said you were too proud to ask for help directly, so he was handling everything discreetly. The grocery shopping, the financial assistance, all of it. He made it sound like he was being noble, sacrificing for family." Stephanie's hands were shaking as she continued. "But the numbers never made sense. We're drowning in debt, Evelyn. Marcus hasn't had steady work in almost a year, and the bills just keep piling up. When I asked how we could afford to help you when we couldn't even afford our own expenses, he said you were contributing what you could and that he was covering the rest because it was the right thing to do." "And you believed that?" "I wanted to believe it," she admitted. Marcus has always been good at making himself sound like the hero of every story. But lately, things have been getting worse. Creditors calling constantly, notices from the building management, threats about repossession of the car. And through it all, Marcus keeps insisting that everything will work out because... Because what, Stephanie? She looked at me with eyes full of shame and fear. Because he said that when you eventually passed away, There would be enough inheritance to solve all our problems. He said Theodore had left you the apartment, building or something, and that as your stepson, he'd inherit everything since you don't have any other family. The pieces clicked into place with devastating clarity. Marcus wasn't just planning to steal my independence through fraudulent guardianship. He was already spending money he expected to inherit from my death. The debt, the creditor negotiations, the timeline of his increasingly desperate behavior, it all made sense now. "Stephanie," I said carefully, "has Marcus ever mentioned wanting to speed up that timeline?" Her face went white. "What do you mean? Has he ever suggested that my recovery from the accident was taking too long? That maybe I should be in a more institutional setting where my health might decline more quickly?" Oh my God. The coffee cup slipped from her hands, clattering against the saucer. He did mention that nursing homes might be... He said that elderly people often don't last long once they lose their independence. He said it might be kinder to... She couldn't finish the sentence, but she didn't need to. Marcus wasn't just planning to steal from me. He was actively hoping for my death, and possibly considering ways to accelerate it. "Stephanie, I need you to listen very carefully," I said. "Marcus has been lying to you about almost everything. I don't need financial assistance. My medical bills are completely covered by insurance. And the inheritance he's expecting? It doesn't exist in the way he thinks it does." I could see the confusion and dawning horror in her eyes as she processed this information. But more importantly, I continued, "Marcus has been committing serious crimes. Fraud, forgery, identity theft. When this all comes to light, and it will come to light very soon, you and Lily need to be protected." Over the next hour, I laid out everything I'd discovered. The forged documents, the false guardian claims, the bank fraud, the systematic campaign to have me declared incompetent. Stephanie listened in growing shock, occasionally interjecting with details that confirmed my suspicions or revealed new aspects of Marcus's deception. "He's been practicing your signature," she admitted. "I saw him doing it at the kitchen table a few weeks ago. When I asked about it, he said he was helping you with some paperwork because your hands were too shaky from the accident. Has he asked you to witness any documents or sign anything as a character reference?" "Yes, several things. Papers about your mental state, your need for assistance. He said they were for insurance purposes, to make sure you got the care you needed." Every revelation made the scope of Marcus's fraud more apparent. He'd turned his own wife into an unwitting accomplice, using her genuine concern for my welfare to legitimize his lies. "Stephanie, I'm going to make you an offer," I said. "I'm going to give you a chance to save yourself and Lily from what's coming. But you need to decide right now whether you're going to help me stop Marcus or whether you're going to go down with him." She didn't hesitate. "What do you need me to do?" The plan I outlined was straightforward, but required perfect timing and execution. Stephanie would return home and act normally, not revealing anything about our conversation. But she would also start documenting Marcus's activities, particularly his work on forged documents and his communications with creditors, using my name. More importantly, she would help me set up the final trap. "Tomorrow night, Marcus is supposed to meet with a man named Robert Chen," I told her. "Marcus thinks Mr. Chen is a private loan officer who might be willing to provide a significant loan against my anticipated inheritance. What Marcus doesn't know is that Mr. Chen is actually a private investigator working for my attorney." Stephanie's eyes widened. "You're setting him up." "I'm giving him enough rope to hang himself." During that meeting, Marcus will have to present all of his forged documents, repeat all of his lies about his legal authority over my affairs, and make specific claims about my mental incapacity and his role as my guardian. The beauty of the trap was that Marcus wouldn't be able to resist. His financial desperation had reached a critical point, and the loan meeting represented his best chance to solve his immediate problems. He'd arrive with his carefully prepared portfolio of fraudulent documents, confident that he was about to secure the money he needed. Instead, he'd be confessing to multiple felonies in front of a witness who was recording everything. "What happens after the meeting?" Stephanie asked. "That depends partly on you," I said. "I can protect you and Lily if you're willing to testify about what Marcus has told you and what you've witnessed. You'll need to admit to signing documents under false pretenses, but if you cooperate fully, I can ensure that you're treated as a victim rather than an accomplice. And if I don't cooperate, then you'll go down with Marcus when the police arrest him. Because, Stephanie, this isn't going to end with a private confrontation or a family discussion. Marcus has committed serious crimes, and I'm going to make sure he faces serious consequences." That evening, after Stephanie left with her instructions and her choice made, I called Patricia with the final details of our operation. "Everything's in place," I told her. "Robert Chen has the recording equipment, the meeting location is secured, and we have Stephanie's cooperation. Tomorrow night, Marcus will walk into that conference room thinking he's about to solve all his problems. And instead, he's going to confess to enough crimes to put him away for years. But Patricia, I want to make sure we have backup plans. If Marcus suspects anything, if he gets cold feet about the meeting, we need to be ready to spring the trap anyway." "What do you have in mind?" I smiled, looking out my window toward the Grandview Towers building where Marcus lived in blissful ignorance of what was coming. "Let's just say that tomorrow is going to be a very educational day for my dear stepson. He's spent months thinking he was playing chess with a helpless old woman. And now he's going to discover that he's been playing checkers while I've been playing chess. And the game is almost over." The next 24 hours would determine everything. Marcus would either walk into our trap willingly, or I'd have to force his hand. Either way, his reign of terror was about to end, and the reckoning was going to be swift, thorough, and utterly devastating. Marcus wanted to play games with an old woman's life? Fine. But he was about to learn that this particular old woman had been playing games at a level he couldn't even comprehend, and she was tired of letting him think he was winning. Marcus strutted into the Imperial Hotel's conference room that Wednesday evening like a man who'd already won the lottery. He carried a leather portfolio stuffed with what he believed was his ticket to financial salvation, and the confidence radiating from him was almost palpable. Through the one-way glass that separated the observation room from conference room B, I watched him arrange his forged documents with the precision of a surgeon preparing for a complex operation. Robert Chen, our private investigator, had done excellent work creating the perfect persona for this meeting. Dressed in an expensive suit with gold-rimmed glasses and carrying a briefcase that screamed, "Serious money," he looked exactly like the high-end private loan officer Marcus expected to meet. The hidden cameras were positioned perfectly, and the audio equipment would capture every word of what was about to unfold. "Good evening, Mr. Blackwood," Chen said, extending his hand with just the right mixture of professionalism and warmth. "I understand you're interested in discussing a substantial loan arrangement." Marcus's smile was predatory as he shook Chen's hand. "That's right. As I mentioned on the phone, I'm in a unique position to offer some very solid collateral. My mother's estate represents significant value, and while the timing isn't ideal, family obligations sometimes require creative financial solutions." The lie rolled off his tongue so smoothly that for a moment, I wondered if Marcus had started believing his own fiction. He'd moved so seamlessly from stepmother to mother that the deception seemed natural to him now. "Tell me about your mother's situation," Chen said, settling into his chair and opening a notebook. "You mentioned some health concerns that have created financial pressures." "It's been very difficult," Marcus said, his voice taking on the practiced tone of a devoted son bearing a heavy burden. "Mom suffered a serious accident a few months ago, fell from her balcony. The medical bills have been astronomical, and unfortunately, her cognitive state has deteriorated significantly since the fall." He opened his portfolio and began spreading documents across the conference table. "I have medical documentation here, showing the extent of her dementia as well as the legal paperwork establishing my guardianship and power of attorney. Chen examined the papers with apparent interest, occasionally making notes. From my vantage point, I could see Marcus's confidence, growing with each passing minute. He thought he was minutes away from securing the loan that would solve all his problems. "These appear to be quite comprehensive," Chen said. "Your mother's condition must be quite advanced if these measures were necessary." "Unfortunately, yes," Marcus replied with what he probably thought was appropriate sadness. "She can barely remember my name from day to day. Last week, I found her trying to cook dinner at 3 in the morning, completely confused about what time it was. She's become a danger to herself, really." The fictional medical history he'd been building for months spilled out in vivid detail. According to Marcus, I regularly forgot to turn off appliances, wandered the hallways of my building in confusion, and had to be reminded multiple times daily about basic personal care. He painted a picture of a woman so far gone that institutional care was inevitable. "The doctors say she probably has 6 months to a year before we'll have no choice but to move her to a full care facility," Marcus continued. "Which is why the timing of this loan is so critical. I need to be able to cover her immediate expenses while we transition her care, and then when the inevitable happens, the estate will more than cover the loan amount plus interest." Chen nodded sympathetically. "And you're confident about the value of the estate?" This was the moment I'd been waiting for. Marcus leaned forward, his eyes lighting up with the excitement of someone who thought he was about to close the deal of a lifetime. "The apartment building alone is worth at least $2 million, he said. "It's a luxury property in the best part of Millbrook Heights, fully occupied with a waiting list for units. Mom inherited it from my father, and while she doesn't understand its value anymore, I've had it appraised recently." He pulled out a document that made my breath catch, an actual property appraisal for Grandview Towers, the building where Marcus lived. But this wasn't just any appraisal. This was a forged document that had been altered to show my name as the owner instead of the complex web of LLCs that actually held the title. Beyond the apartment building, there are several other properties, some commercial real estate investments, and a substantial stock portfolio, Marcus continued, warming to his subject. Conservative estimates put the total estate value at somewhere between $5 and $8 million. The numbers were interesting. Marcus clearly had some sense that I was worth more than he'd originally thought, but he was still operating with incomplete information. His estimate of my net worth was only about 15% of the actual figure, but it was enough to fuel his greed and desperation. "I'm prepared to offer the entire estate as collateral for a loan of $750,000, Marcus said. "I know it seems like I'm asking for less than the asset value, but I need the liquidity immediately, and I'm willing to accept those terms for quick processing." Chen made a show of reviewing the documents again, occasionally asking clarifying questions that allowed Marcus to dig himself deeper into his web of lies. Each response was another nail in his coffin, another recorded admission of fraud and forgery. "You mentioned that your mother's cognitive state has deteriorated," Chen said. "Has she been legally declared incompetent?" "The paperwork is in process," Marcus replied smoothly. "But functionally, I'm already handling all her affairs. She signs whatever I put in front of her without really understanding what it is. The formal declaration is just a bureaucratic formality at this point." The casual admission of elder abuse was breathtaking in its callousness. Marcus wasn't just committing fraud, he was bragging about it, treating my supposed helplessness as a convenient tool for his financial schemes. "And you're confident she won't interfere with the loan arrangement?" Marcus actually laughed. "Mr. Chen, my mother can barely remember what day it is. She's not going to interfere with anything. If you need her signature on documents, I can easily obtain it. She trusts me completely and signs whatever I tell her to sign." For the next 30 minutes, Marcus continued to incriminate himself with enthusiastic thoroughness. He described in detail how he'd been managing my incompetence, how he'd convinced various institutions that he was my legal guardian, and how he'd been gradually taking control of what he believed were my assets. He even pulled out his notebook, the same one I'd photographed in his apartment, and shared specific examples of my supposed cognitive decline with Chen, presenting his fabricated medical history as if it were documented fact. "Just last week?" Marcus said, consulting his notes. "I found her standing in the courtyard at midnight, completely disoriented. She claimed she was checking on her investments, but of course that was just confused rambling. She hasn't had any investments beyond a simple savings account in decades." The irony was so thick I could practically taste it. As Marcus sat there describing my supposed confusion about my investments, he was literally sitting in a building I owned, having driven there in a car leased through one of my companies to discuss collateralizing assets that belonged to me. Finally, Chen reached the end of his prepared questions. "Mr. Blackwood, this all looks very promising. I'll need to review these documents with my associates, but I'm optimistic we can move forward quickly." Marcus's relief was visible. "How quickly are we talking?" "Given the urgency you've described, I think we could have preliminary approval within 48 hours. Full processing shouldn't take more than a week." As Marcus gathered his forged documents, practically glowing with satisfaction, Chen delivered the final line of our script. "There is one formality we'll need to observe. Our legal department requires that we speak directly with the borrower's mother, just to confirm her understanding of the arrangement. It's a standard protection against elder fraud." For just a moment, Marcus's confidence flickered. "Is that really necessary?" As I explained, her cognitive state makes those kinds of conversations very difficult. "I understand completely," Chen said reassuringly. "We don't need a lengthy discussion. Just a brief conversation to confirm her identity and her awareness, that you're handling her affairs. Our legal team insists on it for loans of this magnitude." Marcus nodded slowly, his mind clearly racing through the implications. "Of course. I'll need to prepare her for the conversation. Explain what's happening in simple terms she can understand. When would you need to speak with her?" "Tomorrow afternoon would be ideal." As Marcus left the hotel, still radiating confidence despite that momentary concern, I felt the first stirrings of the satisfaction that was about to engulf him. He thought he'd just secured his financial future through cleverness and manipulation. Instead, he'd just confessed to multiple felonies while providing us with perfect documentation of his crimes. And in less than 24 hours, when Chen called to arrange that conversation with his supposedly incompetent mother, Marcus was going to discover that the helpless old woman he'd been victimizing was actually the person who controlled everything he thought he was about to steal. The trap was set, the evidence was recorded, and Marcus was about to learn the most expensive lesson of his life. The phone call came at exactly 2:15 p.m. the next afternoon, just as we'd planned. I was sitting in my apartment with Patricia and Detective Walsh, all of us connected to the recording equipment that would capture every word of what was about to unfold. Through my window, I could see Marcus pacing nervously in the courtyard. Below, his phone pressed to his ear as he took the call from Robert Chen. "Mr. Blackwood? This is Robert Chen from Pinnacle Financial. I'm ready to speak with your mother about the loan arrangement we discussed yesterday." From 3 floors below, I could hear the tension in Marcus's voice even without the phone. "Right, yes. Let me get her prepared for the conversation. As I mentioned, her cognitive state can make these discussions challenging." "I understand completely," Chen replied with practiced patience. "Perhaps it would be easier if I came to her apartment directly? Sometimes elderly clients feel more comfortable in familiar surroundings." I watched Marcus freeze in the courtyard, his free hand running through his hair in obvious agitation. "Actually, I think a phone conversation would be less overwhelming for her. She gets anxious around strangers. Let me just go up and get her ready." "Of course. I'll hold while you prepare her." What Marcus didn't know was that Chen was calling. From the lobby of my building, having arrived through the secure entrance using the key I'd provided. As Marcus hurried toward the elevator, Convinced he was about to coach me through a conversation that would secure his fraudulent loan, Chen was already making his way up the back stairs. The setup was perfect. Marcus would have exactly enough. Time to reach my apartment, knock on my door, and begin his desperate attempt to manipulate me into playing along with his scheme before Chen appeared to witness the entire charade. I heard Marcus's footsteps in the hallway, followed by his urgent knocking. "Evelyn? Evelyn, I need to come in. We need to talk right now." I opened the door slowly, making sure to appear confused and slightly unsteady. Exactly the image Marcus had been painting for months. "Marcus? What's wrong? You seem upset." He pushed past me into the apartment, his eyes darting around frantically as if checking for threats. "Listen carefully, Evelyn. There's a man who's going to call in a few minutes, and I need you to answer some questions for him. It's very important that you say exactly what I tell you to say." "I don't understand," I said, letting my voice quaver slightly. "What kind of questions?" "Financial questions. About our family arrangements. You need to confirm that I help take care of you, that I handle your bills and important decisions because you have trouble remembering things." The desperation in his voice was fascinating to observe. This was Marcus stripped of all his confident manipulation, reduced to raw panic as he realized how much depended on my cooperation. "But Marcus," I said, maintaining my confused elderly woman act, "I don't have trouble remembering things, and you don't help with my bills. Why would I tell someone that you do?" His face went pale. "Because, Evelyn, sometimes you get confused and you don't remember everything clearly. That's why I help you. That's why I've been taking care of the important financial matters." "What financial matters?" I asked, blinking at him with apparent bewilderment. Marcus grabbed my shoulders, his grip tight enough to be uncomfortable. "Listen to me very carefully. You had an accident, remember? You fell from the balcony and hurt yourself badly. Since then, you've been having memory problems, confusion. I've been helping you because you can't manage things on your own anymore." The sheer audacity of him trying to gaslight me in real time, attempting to convince me that his fictional version of my life was reality, was breathtaking. But I maintained my performance, nodding slowly as if his words were helping me remember something I'd forgotten. "The accident. Yes, I remember falling. It hurt very much." "That's right," Marcus said, relief flooding his voice. "And since then, I've been taking care of you. I pay your bills, I make your important decisions, I handle all your financial matters because you can't remember how to do those things anymore." Just then, there was another knock at my door. Marcus's head snapped around, terror replacing the relief that had briefly crossed his features. "That's the man I told you about," he whispered urgently. "Remember what I said. You're confused. You can't remember things clearly, and I take care of everything for you." I shuffled to the door and opened it to reveal Robert Chen, still playing. His role as the loan officer, but now with a slightly different energy. Behind him, positioned where Marcus couldn't see them, were Detective Walsh and two uniformed officers. "Mrs. Hartwell," Chen said politely. "I'm Robert Chen from Pinnacle Financial. I believe your son Marcus has told you I'd be stopping by." "My son?" I repeated, looking confused. "Marcus isn't my son. He's my stepson." Marcus stepped forward quickly, his laugh strained and artificial. "Mom gets confused about family relationships sometimes. The accident affected her memory in various ways." But Chen was already looking around the apartment with new eyes, taking in details that contradicted everything Marcus had told him. The expensive artwork on my walls, the high-end electronics, the designer furniture. None of it suggested a woman living on a modest pension who needed financial assistance from her stepson. "Mrs. Hartwell," Chen said carefully, "your son Marcus has told me that you've been having some difficulties managing your finances since your accident. He's applied for a loan using your estate as collateral." "My estate?" I looked genuinely Puzzled now, though for different reasons than Marcus hoped. What estate and what loan? Marcus was sweating visibly now, his carefully constructed world beginning to crumble around him. Mom, we talked about this. The medical bills, the expenses. I explained that we needed to arrange some financial assistance. Marcus, I said, my voice growing stronger and clearer. I don't have any medical bills that aren't covered by insurance. And I certainly haven't authorized you to use anything of mine as collateral for a loan. The transformation in my voice and demeanor was subtle but unmistakable. Chen noticed it immediately, his eyebrows raising slightly as he recognized that the confused, fragile elderly woman was being replaced by someone far more sharp and self-possessed. Perhaps, Chen said. We should discuss this more formally. Mrs. Hartwell, are you aware that Marcus has been representing himself as your legal guardian? My what? The sharpness in my voice was undeniable now. Marcus has no legal authority over my affairs whatsoever. Marcus made one last desperate attempt to salvage the situation. Evelyn, you're getting confused again. Remember what the doctor said about your condition. You signed papers giving me the authority to help with your financial decisions. I've signed no such papers, I said firmly. And Marcus, I think it's time you met some people. That's when Detective Walsh stepped into view, her badge clearly visible. The two uniformed officers followed, effectively blocking any chance Marcus might have had to flee. Marcus Blackwood, Detective Walsh said, her voice crisp and professional. You're under arrest for fraud, forgery, identity theft, and attempted elder abuse. The color drained completely from Marcus's face as the handcuffs clicked into place. This is insane, he stammered. She's confused. She doesn't understand what's happening. She has dementia. Actually, I said, my voice now completely clear and commanding, I understand exactly what's happening. I understand that you've spent months forging documents, lying to financial institutions, and attempting to steal my identity and my assets. Marcus stared at me as if seeing me for the first time, his mouth opening and closing soundlessly as the reality of his situation began to penetrate his shock. The woman you've been trying to victimize, Detective Walsh informed him as she read him his rights, is Evelyn Hartwell, one of the largest private property owners in this region. The estate you thought you were going to inherit? You've been living in one small piece of it for years, completely unaware that your rent-free apartment was just another example of her generosity. As they led Marcus away, still protesting his innocence and insisting that I was mentally incompetent, I walked to my window and looked down at the Grandview Towers building where he'd been living in luxury, supported by the wealth of the woman he'd been systematically trying to destroy. The irony was perfect. Marcus had spent months mocking the helpless old woman he thought had nothing, while living off the charity of the powerful businesswoman he never suspected existed. But this was just the beginning. The arrest was satisfying, but it was only the first step in making sure Marcus understood exactly what kind of power he'd been foolish enough to challenge. The systematic destruction of Marcus's life began within hours of his arrest. But unlike his cruel campaign against me, mine was methodical, legal, and absolutely devastating. While he sat in the Millbrook Heights County Jail trying to make bail with money he didn't have, I was in Patricia's office implementing a carefully orchestrated plan that would strip away every advantage he'd taken for granted. First things first, I told Patricia, as we reviewed the extensive file she'd compiled on Marcus's debts and obligations. I want him evicted from Grandview Towers immediately, since he's 3 months behind on association fees and has no legal right to occupy the property anyway. We can have him out within 48 hours. The lease was never legitimate, Patricia confirmed. Theodore arranged for Marcus to live there through what he thought was a generous gift, but technically, Marcus has been squatting in your property for 2 years since your husband's death. We can have the sheriff's department handle the eviction. But eviction was just the beginning. The real beauty of my plan lay in the cascade of consequences that would follow. Marcus had built his entire adult life on a foundation of lies and borrowed money. using his supposed inheritance expectations as collateral for credit and his false guardian status to negotiate payment delays. When that foundation crumbled, everything built on top of it would collapse in spectacular fashion. "What about his credit situation?" I asked. Patricia consulted her notes. "It's worse than we initially thought. He's leveraged against every asset he thought he had access to, including several loans where he listed your estate as collateral. When the banks discover he has no legal claim to any of your property, they'll demand immediate payment in full." The phone calls started that afternoon. Bank representatives, credit card companies, and private lenders began reaching out as news of Marcus's arrest spread through the financial community. His carefully constructed web of debt, held together by promises of future inheritance and fabricated guardian authority, unraveled with breathtaking speed. "Mrs. Hartwell," said the loan officer from First National Bank when he called, "we understand there may have been some misrepresentation regarding a loan secured by Mr. Blackwood, using your estate as collateral. Can you confirm whether you authorized this arrangement?" "I most certainly did not," I replied firmly. "Marcus Blackwood has no legal authority over my affairs and no legitimate claim to any inheritance from my estate. Any documents suggesting otherwise are fraudulent." Within hours, Marcus's credit lines were frozen, his loans were called in, and his assets were seized. The luxury car he'd been driving, the one he'd used to project an image of success while secretly drowning in debt, was repossessed from the jail parking lot while he sat in his cell. But I wasn't content to let impersonal financial institutions handle all the consequences. Marcus had made this personal with his cruelty, his mockery of my pain, and his systematic campaign to destroy my independence. He deserved to understand exactly who was orchestrating his downfall and why. The next phase began when Stephanie came to see me, as I'd known she would. She arrived at my apartment 3 days after Marcus's arrest, looking haggard and desperate, clutching Lily's hand as if her daughter were the only solid thing left in her world. "Evelyn," she said, her voice hollow with shock. "I don't understand. What's happening? They've taken the car. They're trying to evict us from the apartment, and Marcus's lawyer says the bail is set so high we can't possibly afford it." "Sit down, Stephanie," I said gently, leading her to the couch while Lily wandered over to examine my bookshelf. "Let me explain what's happening and what options you have." Over the next hour, I laid out the full scope of Marcus's crimes and the consequences he was facing. Prison time was virtually certain. The evidence was overwhelming, and the district attorney was pursuing maximum penalties for what they were calling one of the most brazen elder fraud cases in the county's history. "But you can save yourself and Lily," I told her. "Your cooperation in the investigation has already protected you from being charged as an accessory, and I'm prepared to help you start over, completely separate from Marcus and his legal problems." The why offer I made Stephanie was generous but conditional. I would provide her with enough money to relocate anywhere she wanted, help her find employment, and ensure that Lily's education was fully funded through college. In exchange, Stephanie would testify truthfully about Marcus's behavior, provide any additional evidence that might be helpful to the prosecution, and agree to a complete break from Marcus. "No visits, no letters, no contact of any kind," I specified. "If you're going to rebuild your life, you need to do it without any connection to the man who nearly destroyed all of us." Stephanie agreed without hesitation. The Marcus she'd married, or thought she'd married, had been revealed as a fraud, and she was ready to save herself and her daughter from the wreckage of his choices. The eviction from Grandview Towers proceeded exactly as scheduled. Sheriff's deputies arrived on Friday morning to remove Marcus's belongings from the penthouse apartment he'd never legally occupied. Since he was still in jail awaiting trial, unable to make the $500,000 bail that had been set, his possessions were simply boxed up and placed in storage. But I had one final surprise waiting for him there. When Marcus was eventually released on a reduced bail that his public defender had negotiated, he would discover that his expensive furniture, his designer clothes, and his collection of luxury items had all been tagged for seizure by his creditors. The man who had mocked my modest lifestyle would be left with literally nothing but the clothes he'd been wearing when arrested. The criminal trial moved forward with relentless efficiency. The recording from his meeting with Robert Chen provided damning evidence of his fraudulent intent, while the forged documents found in his apartment proved the scope of his deception. Stephanie's testimony about his plans and his systematic lies sealed his fate completely. But perhaps the most devastating moment came when the prosecutor presented evidence of Marcus's true financial situation to the court. For years, he'd been living a lifestyle that cost nearly $200,000 annually while earning less than $30,000 from his sporadic consulting work. Every luxury, every expensive dinner, every designer purchase had been financed through credit secured against an inheritance he would never receive. The defendant, the prosecutor told the jury, was living in a fantasy where he had convinced himself that he deserved wealth he had never earned, supported by a woman he simultaneously despised and exploited. The sentencing hearing provided my opportunity to address the court directly, to explain not just the financial impact of Marcus's crimes, but the emotional devastation of being victimized by someone who was supposed to be family. "Your Honor," I said, rising slowly but steadily, my voice carrying the full weight of my anger and disappointment. The defendant didn't just try to steal my money. He tried to steal my dignity, my independence, and my right to live my final years in peace. He mocked my pain, exploited my grief over my husband's death, and systematically worked to isolate me from everyone who cared about me. I paused, looking directly at Marcus for the first time since his arrest. He sat hunched, in his orange jumpsuit, no longer the confident man who had laughed at my balcony accident. But perhaps most importantly, Your Honor, the defendant fundamentally misunderstood what he was dealing with. He saw an elderly woman and assumed weakness. He saw modest living and assumed poverty. He saw kindness and assumed stupidity. The judge sentenced Marcus to 12 years in prison, 6 for the fraud charges, 4 for the forgery, and 2 for attempted elder abuse, to be served consecutively. He would also be required to pay full restitution, though since he had no assets, that was largely symbolic. As the bailiff led Marcus away to begin his sentence, he turned back one last time, his eyes finding mine across the courtroom. The look he gave me was no longer cruel or mocking. It was the look of a man who finally understood exactly how badly he had miscalculated. Marcus had wanted to play games with a helpless old woman. Instead, he'd gone to war with one of the most powerful people in the region, and the war was over. But even prison wouldn't be the end of his education. I had plans that would ensure Marcus's suffering continued long after the courtroom doors closed behind him. The final reckoning came not in a courtroom, but in the place where Marcus had spent so many months feeling superior to his helpless stepmother, his former penthouse apartment. 6 months into his prison sentence, I arranged for a special visit that would deliver the last, most devastating lesson of his education. Prison had not been kind to Marcus. The man who had once strutted through Millbrook Heights in designer clothes and luxury cars was now gaunt, hollow-eyed, and wearing the orange jumpsuit that marked him as what he'd always truly been, a criminal. When the guards brought him to the conference room at Millbrook Correctional Facility, shackled at the wrists and ankles, he could barely look at me. "Hello, Marcus," I said, settling into my chair with the same calm dignity I'd maintained throughout his trial. I thought, it was time we had a real conversation. He stared at the table, his voice barely audible when he finally spoke. "What do you want, Evelyn? Haven't you done enough?" "Done enough?" I repeated, genuinely puzzled by his perspective. "Marcus, I haven't even begun to show you the full scope of what you tried to steal from me." That's when I opened the portfolio I'd brought with me. Not the forged documents he'd created to support his fraud, but the real documentation of my actual holdings. Property deeds, stock certificates, business ownership papers, and financial statements that revealed the true extent of the empire I'd built over nearly 5 decades. "You thought you were going to inherit $5 to $8 million, I said, spreading the documents across the table between us. "Would you like to know what you actually would have missed out on?" Marcus's eyes widened as he began to comprehend the numbers before him. Property values alone exceeded $50 million. The stock portfolio was worth another $30 million. Business interests, commercial real estate, and various investments brought the total well over $100 million. "The penthouse apartment where you lived rent-free for 2 years," I continued conversationally, "that was worth about $800,000. It represented less than 1% of what you thought you were entitled to inherit through manipulation and fraud. But the real revelation was still coming. I pulled out a document that made Marcus's hands tremble as he read it. The original will that Theodore had written. The one that Marcus had never seen because he'd been too busy planning to steal from me to bother learning about his father's actual wishes. "Your father was more generous than you deserved," I told him. "If you had simply been a decent person, if you had treated me with basic respect and kindness, you would have inherited $20 million outright, plus a trust fund that would have provided you with $500,000 annually for the rest of your life." Marcus's face went white as the implications sank in. That's not possible." "It's all there in black and white," I said, tapping the will. "Theodore left you more money than most people see in 10 lifetimes. All you had to do was not be a complete monster to his widow." The sound that came from Marcus's throat was part sob, part scream. He'd thrown away a fortune that would have set him up for life, all because he couldn't resist the urge to torment and exploit the woman he thought was helpless. "But that's not even the best part of this story," I continued, my voice taking on the cold satisfaction I'd been saving for this moment. "Do you remember all those jokes you made about my balcony accident? All that laughter about my flying lessons and gravity problems?" Marcus nodded numbly, clearly dreading whatever was coming next. "Well, Marcus, I think it's time you learned something interesting about that accident." I pulled out another set of documents, building inspection reports, maintenance records, and photographs. "The loose floorboard that caused my fall? It had been reported to building maintenance 3 times over the previous 2 months. By me." His confusion was obvious, so I continued. "You see, I knew that board was dangerous. I'd filed multiple work orders to have it repaired. But I also knew that my stepson had been making increasingly desperate comments about my health, my age, and how much easier everyone's life would be if I were in a nursing home, or dead." The realization hit him like a physical blow. Marcus leaned back in his chair, his mouth falling open as he understood what I was telling him. "You wanted me to have an accident," he whispered. "I suspected you might try to arrange one," I corrected. "So I decided to beat you to it. I chose the time, the place, and the severity of my own fall. I controlled every aspect of what you thought was a random accident." The truth was even more devastating than Marcus could have imagined. The accident that had been the source of so much of his cruel entertainment, the fall that had given him so many opportunities to mock my weakness and vulnerability. I had orchestrated it myself, as the opening move in a chess game he'd never realized he was playing. "But why?" he asked, his voice breaking. "Why go through all that pain?" "Because I needed to see who you really were," I replied simply. "I needed to know if you were worth saving, if there was any decency left in Theodore's son. The accident was a test, Marcus, and you failed it spectacularly." I stood up, gathering my documents as the full weight of his situation finally settled over him. Every cruel joke, every moment of mockery, every time you laughed at my pain, you were laughing at something I had chosen to endure in order to give you one last chance to prove you weren't completely worthless. Marcus was crying now. Great, heaving sobs that shook his entire body. "I didn't know," he kept repeating. "I didn't know." "No," I agreed. "You didn't know. And that ignorance cost you everything." But I wasn't finished with him yet. The final twist of the knife came with the last document in my portfolio, a power of attorney that I'd never mentioned during his trial. This is a legal document giving me complete authority over your prison experience, I explained calmly. You see, when someone is convicted of elder fraud, their victim can be granted certain rights regarding their incarceration conditions. Marcus looked up at me in terror, finally understanding that even behind bars, he wasn't safe from the consequences of his choices. I've arranged for you to be transferred to a facility in Alaska, I continued. Minimum security, but very isolated. Very cold. Very far from anyone who might visit you. You'll serve your full sentence there, with no possibility of early parole. Please, he begged, reaching toward me with his shackled hands. Please, I'm sorry. I didn't understand. I'll do anything. I looked down at this broken man who had once mocked my pain and tried to steal my life, and felt nothing but cold satisfaction. Marcus, I said, my voice as final as a judge's gavel, you had your chance to do anything. You chose to be cruel instead of kind. You chose to be greedy instead of grateful. And you chose to attack someone you thought was helpless instead of protecting someone who actually needed care. I walked toward the door, then paused for one final observation. Your father used to say that a person's true character shows when they think no one important is watching. You spent months showing me your true character, Marcus, and your true character is why you're here, wearing shackles, while I'm walking away free. The last sound I heard as the door closed behind me was Marcus calling my name, his voice echoing through the concrete corridors like the cry of a man falling through empty air, finally understanding what it felt like to be truly helpless, truly alone, and truly at the mercy of someone more powerful than himself. The student had become the teacher, and the lesson was complete. 2 years after Marcus disappeared into the Alaska Correctional System, I stood in the sunlit conference room of Hartwell Foundation headquarters, looking out over the thriving city of Millbrook Heights that had become my legacy. The transformation wasn't just in the buildings and businesses that dotted the landscape. It was in me, and in the purpose I'd discovered in the aftermath of my stepson's betrayal. The Hartwell Foundation had grown from a simple idea into something I'd never imagined when I first conceived it during those dark months of recovery. What started as a way to channel my anger into something productive had become the most fulfilling work of my life, reaching hundreds of elderly victims across 3 states and fundamentally changing how elder abuse cases were handled in our region. Mrs. Hartwell, said Jennifer Martinez, my foundation's director of victim services, as she entered with a stack of case files, I have the quarterly report you requested. The numbers are remarkable. In the past 18 months alone, the Hartwell Foundation had assisted 347 elderly victims of financial fraud, recovered over $12 million in stolen assets, and successfully prosecuted 89 family members who had been exploiting their elderly relatives. But the statistics that meant the most to me were simpler. 347 people who no longer had to live in fear, who had their dignity restored, and who understood that being old didn't make them powerless. Tell me about the Richardson case, I said, settling into my chair with the satisfaction of someone who had found her true calling. Breakthrough yesterday, Jennifer reported with evident pride. The grandson who'd been draining Mrs. Richardson's accounts while claiming to be her caregiver pled guilty to all charges. Full restitution, plus 5 years in prison. She'll be able to keep her house and maintain her independence. Each case we handled felt personal to me now. I saw my own story reflected in every victim who had been mocked, manipulated, or dismissed, because someone thought age made them vulnerable. The difference was that I'd had the resources to fight back on my own. Through the foundation, I could extend that same power to people who needed it most. The work had also brought unexpected personal rewards. My team consisted largely of people who had their own experiences with elder abuse, attorneys who had watched grandparents victimized, social workers who had seen too many cases slip through bureaucratic cracks, and investigators who understood That family betrayal cut deeper than any stranger's crime. "There's someone here to see you," Jennifer said, consulting her notes. "Stephanie Blackwood. Well, Stephanie Chen now. She remarried last year." I smiled at that news. Stephanie's transformation had been as remarkable as my own, though in a different direction. She'd taken my offer of a fresh start and built something beautiful from it. Last I'd heard, she was working as a victim advocate in Oregon, helping other women escape abusive situations while raising Lily in a stable, loving environment. When Stephanie entered my office, the change in her was striking. Gone was the nervous, beaten-down woman who had sat in my apartment 3 years ago, trying to understand how her world had collapsed. This Stephanie stood tall, carried herself with confidence, and had the clear eyes of someone who had faced the worst and survived. "Evelyn," she said, her voice warm with genuine affection. "Thank you for seeing me. I hope you don't mind that I brought someone with you to meet." Behind her came Lily, now 11 years old and radiating the kind of confidence that comes from growing up knowing you're safe and loved. She'd inherited her father's dark hair, but none of his cruelty, and her handshake was firm when she introduced herself. "Mrs. Hartwell," Lily said with the serious demeanor of a child who had learned early that words had power. "I wanted to thank you for helping my mom and me when everything got scary." "You're very welcome, sweetheart," I replied, genuinely moved by her directness. "How are you doing in your new school?" "Really good. Mom says I'm going to be a lawyer when I grow up, so I can help people like you do." The irony wasn't lost on me. Marcus's daughter was going to grow up fighting for justice, inspired by the work I'd started in response to her father's crimes. Sometimes the universe had a sense of poetry that took my breath away. Over lunch, Stephanie filled me in on her new life. She'd completed her social work degree, something she'd abandoned years earlier when Marcus convinced her that his career would support them both. Her new husband was a fellow advocate who understood her past and supported her mission. Most importantly, she'd found work that gave her life meaning beyond her own experiences. "I wanted you to know," she said as our conversation wound down, "that what you did, giving me a chance to rebuild instead of just cutting me loose, it changed everything. Not just for me, but for every person I've been able to help since then." After they left, I found myself reflecting on the unexpected gifts that had emerged from my darkest period. Marcus's betrayal had revealed to me that I'd been living too small, too quietly, wasting the power I'd accumulated over a lifetime. His cruelty had awakened something in me that I didn't even know existed. A fierce protective instinct not just for myself, but for everyone who found themselves in similar situations. The phone call came late that afternoon, as they always did on the anniversary of Marcus's sentencing. It was his prison counselor in Alaska, following up on the psychological evaluation we'd requested. "Mrs. Hartwell," the counselor said, "I have to say, your stepson's progress has been minimal. He still maintains that he was trying to help you, that the fraud charges were based on misunderstandings. He seems genuinely unable to grasp that what he did was wrong." I wasn't surprised. Marcus had always been someone who could twist any narrative to make himself the victim. Prison hadn't changed his fundamental character. It had just removed his ability to act on his worst impulses. "Has he expressed any remorse for his actions?" I asked. Remorse for getting caught, certainly, but genuine understanding of the harm he caused? No. He spends most of his time complaining about how unfairly he's been treated and fantasizing about the lawsuits he plans to file when he's released. 7 more years. Marcus would spend 7 more years in his isolated facility, convinced that he was the wronged party in our story. Part of me almost pitied him. The inability to learn from such devastating consequences suggested a kind of spiritual blindness that would follow him for the rest of his life. That evening, I stood on my balcony, the same balcony where this entire story had begun with my carefully orchestrated fall. The loose floorboard had long since been repaired, but I'd kept the space exactly as it was, a reminder of the night I'd chosen to endure pain in order to discover the truth about someone I'd hoped to love. The courtyard below was peaceful the fading light, filled with neighbors who knew me now as Mrs. Hartwell, the foundation director, rather than the frail widow they'd once pitied. Children played while their parents chatted, creating the kind of community Theodore and I had always envisioned when we'd first started building in Millbrook Heights. My phone buzzed with a text from Jennifer. "Just got word. The Morrison case settled. Full recovery of stolen funds, plus the nephew agreed to mandatory counseling. Another victory. Another family saved. Another elderly person who would sleep peacefully tonight knowing they were protected. Another predator who had learned that victimizing the elderly came with serious consequences." I thought about the letter I'd received last week from a woman in California whose foundation work had been inspired by reading about my case in a legal journal. She'd started her own advocacy organization and wanted to share strategies for identifying and prosecuting family financial abuse. The ripple effects kept expanding, carrying the lessons of my experience to places I'd never imagined. Marcus had intended to destroy one old woman's life for his own convenience. Instead, his actions had created a network of protection and advocacy that was changing how society treated its most vulnerable members. As the stars appeared over Millbrook Heights, I raised a glass of wine to the view below, not in celebration of Marcus's suffering, that had never been the point, but in recognition of what had grown from the ashes of his betrayal. I was 77 years old, wealthier than ever, surrounded by meaningful work and genuine relationships. I had survived my stepson's worst intentions and emerged not just unbroken, but stronger and more purposeful than I'd ever been. Marcus had wanted to prove that age made me powerless. Instead, he'd given me the motivation to discover just how powerful I could be. The old woman who had fallen from this balcony 3 years ago had been content to live quietly, to let others underestimate her, to hide her light under a bushel of modesty and privacy. The woman I'd become understood that true power wasn't just about what you could accumulate, it was about what you could protect, what you could build, and what you could leave behind. Marcus was counting days until his release, dreaming of lawsuits and revenge. I was building a legacy that would outlast us both, one rescued victim at a time. And that, I thought as I headed inside to prepare for another day of meaningful work, was the sweetest victory of all. The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning in spring, 3 years after I'd visited Marcus in prison for what I'd assumed would be our final conversation. The return address showed Alaska State Correctional Facility, and my name was written in the shaky handwriting of someone whose hands had forgotten how to hold a pen steady. I almost threw it away unopened. Marcus had written dozens of letters over the years, angry screeds about wrongful imprisonment, desperate pleas for legal assistance, rambling manifestos about how he'd been framed. I'd stopped reading them after the first few, letting Patricia handle the legal implications while I focused on more productive pursuits. But something about this letter felt different. Maybe it was the careful way my name was written, or the fact that it was shorter than his usual multi-page rants. Against my better judgment, I opened it. "Dear Evelyn, I know you probably won't read this, and I don't blame you. I wouldn't read a letter from me either, after everything I did. But I needed to write it anyway, because I finally understand something that took me 8 years in this place to figure out. I destroyed myself. Not you. Me. Every choice I made, every lie I told, every moment I chose cruelty over kindness. I was building my own prison long before I ever saw the inside of this one. I've been taking classes here, psychology, mostly, trying to understand how I became the person who could laugh at your pain. The counselor says I have something called narcissistic personality disorder, which is just a fancy way of saying I was so wrapped up in my own problems that I couldn't see other people as real human beings. That doesn't excuse what I did. Nothing excuses what I did. but it helps me understand why I was capable of it. I heard about the foundation. One of the guards here, his grandmother was helped by your organization when her son was stealing her Social Security checks. He told me you've saved hundreds of people from going through what I put you through. I don't know if this means anything coming from me, but I'm proud of what you built from the wreckage of my mistakes. You took the worst thing I could do and turned it into something that helps people. That's the kind of person my father saw in you, the kind of person I was too selfish and stupid to recognize. I get out in 4 years. I know you never want to see me again, and I understand that, but I wanted you to know that when I do get out, I'm going to spend whatever time I have left trying to make up for the damage I caused. Not to you. I know that's impossible. But maybe I can help someone else avoid becoming the kind of person I was. I'm sorry, Evelyn. I'm sorry for laughing at your pain, for trying to steal your dignity, for betraying Dad's memory, and for all the ways I failed to be the person you deserved. In your family, I hope you never have to think about me again after this letter. You deserve peace. Marcus. I read the letter 3 times before setting it down on my desk. Outside my office window, the spring sunshine illuminated the Millbrook Heights skyline, highlighting buildings that housed dozens of families who were safe and secure partly because of the work we'd built from Marcus's betrayal. Jennifer knocked and entered with the day's case files. "You look thoughtful today," she observed. "Everything all right?" "Marcus wrote to me," I said, handing her the letter. For the first time in 8 years, it sounds like he actually understands what he did. She read it quickly, her eyebrows rising with surprise. "That's not what I expected from him. Do you think he means it?" "I think he's finally hit bottom. Hard enough to start looking up," I replied. Whether that translates into genuine change remains to be seen. The truth was, I felt something I hadn't expected when I finished reading Marcus's letter. Relief. Not forgiveness. That was a gift. I wasn't ready to give and wasn't sure he'd earned. But relief that the man who had caused so much pain was finally capable of acknowledging that pain instead of justifying it. "What are you going to do?" Jennifer asked. I thought about that question for the rest of the day. By evening, I had my answer. I wrote back. Not a long letter, and not a particularly warm one, but a response that acknowledged his growth while making clear that understanding his mistakes didn't erase their consequences. "Marcus, I received your letter. I appreciate that you've finally begun to understand the harm you caused, not just to me, but to yourself and your family. You're right that what you built from your choices was your own prison. The difference between us is that I built something else from those same choices, something that protects people instead of hurting them. If you're sincere about wanting to make amends, don't try to make them to me. Make them to the next elderly person you meet who needs help instead of exploitation. Make them to families who are struggling by offering support instead of taking advantage. Make them by becoming someone your father would have been proud of, instead of someone who traded his legacy for temporary gain. The foundation will be here long after both of us are gone, helping people who find themselves in the position you put me in. That's your real amends. Every person we help, every predator we stop, every family we keep together. You gave me the motivation to build something meaningful from the worst experience of my life. I don't expect to see you when you're released, and I don't think that would be good for either of us. But if you mean what you wrote, then live a life that honors the lesson instead of repeating the mistake. Evelyn. I sealed the letter and placed it in my outgoing mail, then walked out onto my balcony as the sun set over Millbrook Heights. The same balcony where I'd fallen 3.5 years ago, setting in motion the chain of events that had transformed my quiet retirement into the most purposeful period of my life. My phone buzzed with a text from Lily, now 14 and still determined to become a lawyer. She'd started volunteering with local seniors, reading to them and helping them with basic technology. Her message included a photo of her teaching an 80-year-old man how to video call his grandchildren. Teaching Mr. Peterson to use FaceTime, her message read. He says to tell you thank you for showing him that young people can still be kind, even when they don't have to be. I smiled, remembering that child's promise to help people like I did. Marcus's daughter was growing up to be everything her father had failed to become: kind, thoughtful, and committed to lifting others up instead of tearing them down. The letter I'd sent to Alaska wouldn't fix the past or restore the relationship that might have been possible if Marcus had chosen differently. But it represented something important: the recognition that even the worst betrayals could become the foundation for something better if you had the courage to build on the ruins instead of living in them. Whether Marcus would actually change remained to be seen. But I'd learned that my healing didn't depend on his transformation. My peace didn't require his redemption. The work I'd built would continue regardless of whether he ever became worthy of the second chance he'd thrown away. As the stars appeared over the city I'd helped build, I thought about the hundreds of people sleeping safely tonight because someone had been willing to stand up for them. People like me, who discovered that being underestimated could be the greatest advantage of all. Marcus had wanted to prove that age made me powerless. Instead, he'd given me the chance to prove that real power wasn't about what you could take from others. It was about what you could give, what you could protect, and what you could build that would outlast your own life. The old woman who'd fallen from this balcony was gone, replaced by someone who understood that the most dangerous opponents are the ones who let you think you're winning until the moment they reveal they've been playing an entirely different game, and I was still playing to win. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.